Chapter 4: Adventure and Desire. The same month I turned 20 years old, I left home and relocated to Southeast Asia. What began as a short trip had swiftly grown into something much larger. I stepped into work that would shape the next chapter of my life. My life in Southeast Asia was being built in a way that felt both temporary and deeply rooted. I was young, independent, and still learning how to stand on my own feet in a world far bigger than anything I had grown up knowing. I carried confidence in some areas and complete uncertainty in others, a strange mix of maturity and youth that defined much of that season of my life. Asia had become understandable in ways that surprised me. The dense air, the layering of languages, food stalls, motorbikes, crowded sidewalks, and temple corners had woven themselves into my daily motion. What once overwhelmed me had settled into normal life. I navigated streets I once would have gotten lost in, ordered meals in broken phrases that somehow worked, and learned how to exist comfortably in a place that never truly slowed down. I first discovered my faith on my own and made the decision to follow it when I was 8 years old. My parents encouraged it, but it was always understood to be personal. Faith was not something that could be handed down. Each person had to find it and choose it for themselves. As I progressed into my teenage years, the noise of the world grew louder, and that faith faded into the background. I stopped noticing the presence I had once felt so clearly. Years later, I reached a point where I stepped away from the pace of life and began searching for something more than routine, more than success, more than the world around me. In that space, I heard it again. A still small voice within my spirit. It was the same voice I had known as a child, calling me back to the faith I had chosen years earlier. That voice shaped many of the decisions that followed and never led me astray. Along with it came a sense of purpose I could not fully explain. It drew me toward people and places beyond my own plans. Some might compare it to the pull the ocean once held for mariners, but for me it reached deeper than that. It led me toward a life of service among people whose needs were far greater than my own. My work centered on humanitarian aid. We supplied food, water, medicine, and shelter to those impacted by crisis or poverty, facilitating connections between nonprofits, NGOs, and local organizations. On paper, that sounds structured. In reality, it meant long days, moving between villages, storage rooms stacked with supplies, crowded buses, and conversations held through translators and hand gestures when words failed. It was hands-on work, a way to live my faith, build relationships, and reflect on my personal mission. Part of that work was hosting visiting teams of medical outreach groups, English teachers, and volunteers, working with kids in group homes. We played, we built, we taught, we shifted supplies. They organized some days. Flights experienced delays. Trucks broke down. Supplies arrived short. Plans changed constantly, and I learned quickly that flexibility was more valuable than perfection. I mastered everything about logistics and leadership, with housing, feeding, transporting, translating, and finding labor. Everything a tour guide does, but deeper. Every trip, every project was a lesson in patience, problem solving, and faith in action. We recognized the need for help and subsequently broadened our efforts beyond relationships to encompass logistics, safety, and ongoing problem resolution. Coordinating visiting teams became part of daily life. Some groups came for cultural exchange. Others brought medical training or treatment clinics. Doctors, dentists, and optometrists gave their time and personal funding to serve in villages with little or no access to care. Our responsibility was to make sure they could function well in environments that offered almost no comfort. When the medical team needed extra hands, I assisted with procedures under supervision. I helped remove badly infected teeth, treated widespread infections, and watched medical teams train local responders in emergency triage during periods of civil unrest. Some teams worked in leper colonies, where care was both physically and emotionally demanding. The work was practical, immediate, and deeply needed. There were lessons in plumbing, pride, and the perils of being a foreigner. We lived in a gated community. Not all dangers announced themselves. Some arrived and smelled worse. We came back from a few weeks away to find everything baked and brittle. The grass was yellow, the plants sulking, everything parched, except for one patch of lush green. I knew better. The grey water line had been emptying itself outside the house. The grass wasn't thriving on sunshine. It was thriving on our shower runoff, and who knows what else. We reported it to the head guard, who acted like both security chief and neighborhood mayor. He assured us he would take care of it. The next morning, the man arrived in spotless white from head to toe. White jacket, white pants, white sneakers. In one hand, he carried a shovel, and in the other, nothing but serene confidence. For hours, he wrestled with the sewer pipe outside our window. By mid-afternoon, he was filthy from the knees down, still working without complaints or help. We stayed behind the window, smiling, offering drinks, but never touching a thing. The hard-working gentleman's white suit was a disaster. In Asia, saving face matters. Let someone walk away from a mess looking accomplished and unembarrassed, and you do not interfere. Eventually, the blockage revealed itself. Leftover construction debris, rebar, concrete, junk, shoved into the sewer years before. He pulled it all out, piece by piece. The patch of green faded. He came to give his final report. We thanked him. He had worked hard. Then he paused, squinted at us, and said in perfect seriousness, "You know what the problem is?" We waited. "You foreigners, your poop is too dry." I blinked, wondering if my language skills had failed me. They had not. I had heard him correctly. Our poop. Too dry, not the concrete, the rebar, or the pile of construction junk he had spent all day shoveling. In his mind, the real culprit was the mysterious dryness of Western digestion. My friend standing next to me tried not to laugh. He left, head held high, white sneakers squelching in the mud, sewer fixed, dignity preserved. It didn't get easier on land. The buses themselves were an adventure. You always hoped for a window seat, not for the view, but so you could breathe. Someone near the front inevitably became carsick, leaning out the window to vomit, and if your own window was open at the wrong moment, you learned rapidly to shut it. People strapped motorcycles, chickens, and sometimes goats to the roof. Under the seats, pigs squealed inside sacks, with their heads poking out like curious children. It was chaos and routine existing all together. On one of our bus trips, we ground to a halt on the side of a mountain, the pass ahead completely swallowed by a recent mudslide. We waited there for hours, 8 maybe more, squatting on the dirt with locals and sharing instant ramen collected from a nearby village. A light rain drizzled steadily throughout the day. The mud was slick, the rocks glistened, and no one was sure when it would be safe to cross. The rumor circulated that eventually we would have to hike across the mudslide to reach the other side, where buses heading in the opposite direction waited, ready to swap passengers and continue their journeys. As time passed, we couldn't simply sit and wait. All the passengers climbed down from the bus and began navigating the way on foot. The driver stayed behind, carefully maneuvering the bus around massive boulders that had fallen in the middle of the road. He did a slow turn and waited for passengers from the other side of the mudslide to hike over. Sections of the mountainside had washed away entirely, leaving only narrow stretches of road. Every step carried risks. Small rocks tumbled from above, each one a sharp reminder that the mountain could shift at any moment. On one side, the cliff rose, sheer and sky-high. It dropped away into a dizzying abyss. When the time was right, we carefully passed one another, stepping around slick rocks and patches of loose mud, our hands gripping luggage or each other for balance. Passengers from both sides met in the middle of the mudslide. There was a tense pause each time two people crossed paths, a recognition of shared fear and shared resolve. The buses waited patiently, engines idling, ready to continue once everyone had safely switched sides. Finally, we reached the other side. Relief and exhilaration collided in equal measure. We felt a strange mix of triumph and disbelief, acknowledging that we had done something that probably should never have been attempted. Yet, in that remote place, with no other choice, we had made it. Looking back, the slick mud, the falling rocks, and the sheer drop beside us remain vivid in my memory, a reminder that survival sometimes looks like simply putting one careful foot in front of the other. Experiences like that forced me to think differently about responsibility, not just for myself, but for the people who trusted me to lead them. Those childhood lessons became leadership principles that I carried into the field. I found myself responsible for teams in foreign cities, navigating foreign streets where a single wrong turn could mean getting completely lost. The lessons my parents taught me about independence and preparation suddenly mattered in entirely new ways, and those early years were often navigated without the existence of smartphones. We were once in the heart of a large Asian city, a place where unknown characters adorned the hotel name and the streets formed illogical patterns. The airport sat 45 minutes outside the city. Our entire group had traveled in by bus, exhausted from the flight, disoriented by jet lag and sensory overload. Before anyone headed to their rooms, I gathered the group in the hotel lobby. It was a ritual I had learned to keep. I told them to lock their passports in the hotel safe. Years ago, a foreign passport on the black market could fetch serious money. Even if the risk had lessened over time, losing one still meant a lot of inconvenience. Then I handed each person a hotel business card. It seemed like such a small thing. A small rectangle of paper with the hotel name printed in both English and the local language, along with the address and phone number. But I had learned the hard way that it was one of the most valuable tools you could carry. I told them it was easy to step outside, make 2 turns, and suddenly not know where you were. Street signs would not help you. Even remembering the hotel's name in English often meant nothing to a taxi driver, but if you had that card, you could always get back. No matter how lost you were, hand it to a driver, and they would take you home. It reminded me of my first trip overseas, clutching that handwritten paper slip with characters I could not read, trusting a stranger to take me where I needed to go. That small piece of preparation had been my lifeline. The advice worked every time. People would wander off exploring, get themselves completely turned around, and still find their way back because of a business card tucked in their pocket. But the card was never only about directions, it was about responsibility. When I was leading logistics teams, I would tell people the same thing my dad had always told us growing up. If you get lost, stay put. I will find you. People used to tell me that if they dropped me anywhere in the world with a team, I could still find a way for us all to get home safely. Over time, something shifted inside me. Mission work could no longer be a temporary commitment. It needed to be woven into the way I lived every day. Sustainability, not dependency, became the goal. The life I wanted was one that allowed me to stay, not just visit, serve, and eventually leave. Separately, I founded a tourism business focused on building long-term relationships in communities. The company focused on cultural exchange, immersive travel, and village stays with indigenous families. Introducing small groups of visitors created income for local households. Needs emerged naturally, gaps in supplies, schooling, and access. We expanded humanitarian work, fulfilling requests originating from the ground. Tourism, when done respectfully, becomes a bridge rather than an intrusion. It allowed communities to maintain dignity while creating opportunity. Sometimes our visits coincided with village festivals. Once I brought some friends and their 2 children, about 10 and 12 years old, to what turned out to be a pig slaughtering festival. The villagers were salting, drying, and stuffing the meat back into the pigskins for preservation. They invited us in for tea, and as we entered the dark room, lit only by the fire, it became apparent that the scene looked like something out of a butcher's dream, bowls lined up with blood, entrails, and heads. Mortified, I prepared to apologize for traumatizing the kids. They thought it was the coolest thing they had ever seen. Practical exchange through tourism made aid sustainable by embedding it in existing community structures. Visitors brought skills or connections and partnered with local businesses. The vision behind owning my adventure company was to provide income and stability for myself so that I could stay in Asia permanently and ensure 100% of funding in humanitarian work went to all needed projects. A blend of both worlds. It was the moment the mission stopped feeling like a temporary assignment and started feeling like the shape of my entire life. But bureaucracy was constant. Challenges with permits, visas, money, regulations, shifting rules. It often felt harder than the work itself. Life in the field was rarely comfortable. One village had a terrible flea problem. Animals slept under the raised wooden houses to stay warm, and fleas jumped through the floorboards at night. I could hear them tick, 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 landing on my blanket. I ended up wearing flea collars around my ankles and neck. Ridiculous, yes, but it worked. I even accidentally brought some back to my dog. Later, I lived in the mountains where winters reached -20 Celsius. My concrete blockhouse froze solid. We hung blankets over the doors, sectioning off rooms to trap heat. The year I finally got a wood stove felt like a miracle. My friend and I overfed that stove the first night. We giggled as we sat in long johns, pink and sweating, enjoying being too hot for once. Electricity was unreliable, water froze for months, and filling containers from public taps became a daily ritual. Once, a trickle thawed just enough to flow over the counter in my kitchen, onto the floor, and freeze into an ice rink that lasted 3 days. In the cities, streets teemed with people, rats, and the occasional missing manhole cover. Hotels could cost as little as 42 cents a night. I always carried a sleeping bag liner against bugs, the occasional rat, and sticky sheets. Unpredictability struck without warning. One night, I woke at 1 a.m. with a gurgling stomach. A bowl sat beside my bed. By 4:30, after multiple bouts of vomiting, I lay pale and drained, replaying every meal. I had to make the 18-hour journey back across the border for better care. Hours of dirt roads, river crossings, and minivans left me slumped, barely conscious. Somehow, I made it to the emergency room, dressed in layers meant for winter, while it hovered near 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The diagnosis was typhoid, a waterborne exposure during a reckless cave tubing adventure deep in the river after the rainy season. The cave itself was stunning, but the river current was brutal. I flipped again and again until a local fisherman pulled me ashore. I coughed, sputtered, and thanked him over and over. In the years that followed, I battled tropical illnesses, giardiasis that lingered for 18 months, repeated food poisoning, relentless superflus long before anyone spoke of pandemics. The experiences left me humbled, grateful, and acutely aware of how fragile life can be in places where infrastructure is thin or non-existent. Then the sea reminded the entire world who was really in charge. The Great Asian Tsunami had struck a month earlier. A massive undersea earthquake in the Indian Ocean sent waves racing across coastlines from Indonesia to Sri Lanka. It arrived without warning, wiping out entire towns in minutes and leaving behind a silence louder than the waves themselves. When I arrived a few weeks later, shock had shifted into survival. I joined a small group already working in the southern islands. People needed shelter, food, and clean water, but more than anything, they needed to be seen. Many had lost everything: parents, children, entire families swallowed by the sea. Some were the only ones left from their villages. Homemade DVDs circulated, recorded by survivors and tourists. At the time, there was no social media or live updates, just shaky recordings passed hand to hand. They showed the ocean pulling itself backward before roaring inland, sweeping away people, cars, hotels, and streets. One moment the beach existed. The next, it did not. Walking through abandoned areas, the air felt heavy with salt and grief. Speedboats sat wedged in trees a mile inland. Hotels stood hollowed out, their walls torn away, skeletons of rebar clawing at the sky. I stepped through what had once been a lobby and walked toward a pool. Beside it lay flip-flops, a towel, and sunglasses. Someone had been sunbathing there when the sea came ashore. The people we met were extraordinary. Some were already refugees from civil wars in neighboring countries. They had fled one disaster only to meet another. The tsunami erased borders, histories, and differences in a single surge. We built shelters from tarps and bamboo, distributed water purification tablets, rice, and basic cooking supplies. Sometimes the work was practical. Other times it meant listening, collecting stories and messages meant for the outside world. One woman told me she gave birth while clinging to a tree. The wave carried her far inland. She held on for hours and delivered her baby there in the mud. She named him Wave. Others spoke of families who vanished without a trace. After dropping off another mission team at the airport, I took 2 days alone before heading home. I found a small cove tucked between stretches of coastline that remained untouched. The bungalow sat steps from the water. I ate early and fell asleep as the sun disappeared. My then simple cell phone vibrating against the bedside table woke me near 10 that night. Dozens of missed calls stacked across the screen. A friend's voice shook when I answered. She asked where I was and how close I was to the water. Still half asleep, I laughed and said, "Close enough to have sand at my doorstep." Then she told me to grab my ID and run. Major earthquakes had prompted another tsunami warning. No one knew where the waves might hit. The words cut through the fog. I looked around and noticed the silence. No engines, music, or street vendors calling out. Just emptiness. It felt as though the world had ended while I slept. I grabbed my passport and wallet, slipped on flip-flops, and ran outside with the phone still pressed to my ear. The streets were empty. Everyone had already evacuated. I was the only one left. Her voice rose, urgent now, telling me to get inland to higher ground. That was when I heard a motorcycle racing toward me, a man shouting in the local language and waving for me to come. To come now. Fast. He was doing a final sweep. I jumped on the back, still clutching my phone, still in shock. We sped through dark streets and climbed into the hills. The phone line dropped, and the network collapsed soon after. The last thing I heard was her voice telling me to go higher, away from the water. And I spent the night on the mountainside with the rest of the town. Families huddled under trees, bodies pressed together, eyes fixed on the coastline below, waiting. We could see the faint line where the first tsunami had stopped, a scar across the land no one needed explained. Nobody slept. Some cried softly, others stared into the distance, hollowed out and still. By morning, word spread that waves had come, but smaller this time, enough to terrify, not to destroy. We had been lucky. Tremors passed, and people slowly made their way back down the hillside, trying to travel as if the ground might change its mind. Some refused to return. They had already lost too much once, and could not face the sea again. For me, it was only a glimpse, a small taste of what they had endured. I walked down the hill as the sun rose, shoes coated in red dust, phone dead, heart full of gratitude for the stranger on the motorcycle who had come back for one sleeping foreigner. I carried their story with me, even though I had only touched the edge. Despite it all, I do not regret a single moment. I learned the value of preparation, resilience, and patience. I learned to smile at misfortune, to marvel at beauty, and to carry a deep respect for life in all its unpredictability. Time on the mission field passed, and somewhere along the way, I wondered if marriage might never happen for me. The thought lingered like an unfinished sentence. Maybe it came from the Western church culture I grew up in. Maybe it was simply observation. I'd seen many missionary women remain single, holding out for a perfect partner who never arrived. I struggled with the idea that anyone could perfectly match my list in an imperfect world. I was always open to marrying cross-culturally. That never intimidated me. What concerned me was marrying someone who would ask me to stop being who I was. I rarely dated, partly because life on the field kept me too busy, and partly because I took relationships too seriously to treat them casually. I knew I wanted marriage, even when I did not know who it would be with. If I married, my priorities would shift. The relationship had to support my calling rather than pull me away from it. I wanted someone who could walk inside it with me. Shared leadership mattered within marriage. We would decide together. But my husband would also carry responsibility for the direction of our family. It was never about control. It was about trust, respect, and unity. I watched people chase perfection and later find themselves alone, surprised by how fast time disappeared. I did not want that story for myself. Yet I was never desperate. I loved my life. Adventure, purpose, freedom, and community filled every day. Still, in hushed moments, when the mountains sat still and the world finally stopped asking of me, I spoke to the same inner voice I had carried since childhood. I did not want to walk through life alone. I wanted someone to know me fully, strength and softness alike, and to share this life with someone who truly wanted it too. Sometimes, half smiling at myself, I sat and looked across the vast peaks surrounding me. Into the stillness, I whispered, "Is there anyone out there built strong enough to walk beside me, patient enough to walk with me?" I did not know it yet, but that question was about to be answered.